Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we are going to do a quick overview of American literature from 1950 to 2000. I'm Niladri Chatterjee, Professor, Department of English, University of Kalyani, West Bengal. So let us start the discussion by understanding that there is something very important to what happens to American literature in the 1950s onwards. This is where one would have to take note of the term diversity, because roughly from the 1950s onwards, although there is a lot of writing before that, but roughly from the 1950s onwards, we see a lot of American literature that is being produced by people who are not necessarily regarded as being American in the sense that most people imagine an American to be. So therefore, diversity becomes one of the outstanding features of American literature in the later half of the 20th century. The diversity provides readers with different routes through the texts, context, genres, historical periods, and also a lot of debates and discourses. The American literature is no more homogeneous, rather it is heterogeneous in nature and plural in terms of gender, race, class, color, sexuality, ethnicity, religion. For example, Native Americans, Afro-Americans, Asian Americans, women, lesbian and gays, they are all beginning to voice from their lives, their identities from this period onwards. So the American literature still maintains a unity in the diversity, and there is perhaps, you might find, a symphony in the cacophony. Let us broadly try and understand the way in which we think about American literature. Well, there are, roughly speaking, about 6 periods. We can think about the literature of colonial America, which is from 1607 to 1765. We can think of literature of reason and revolution, which is from 1765 to perhaps the end of the 18th century. We can think about the literature of romanticism from 1800 to 1865. Remember that what we understand as romanticism could very well be called in the American context transcendentalism. So we have to keep that in mind. There is, of course, the literature of realism from 1865 to 1918, literature of modernism from 1918 to 1945, and then we've got contemporary literature, which we broadly classify from, we demarcate from 1950 to the present. Now, the discussion that we are going to have today is going to be based on contemporary American literature, which roughly extends from the year 1950 to 2000, but of course you can include literature that is being produced even now in 2016. 1960s and 1970s, these 2 decades are tremendously important, but before doing that, one should also try to remember what is happening in the 1950s, because as you will already be aware, that even in the 1950s, there are certain major changes that happen in American culture, in American politics, in American society. And this we can actually try to trace from, say for example, the war in Korea, which starts in 1950, followed by the Vietnam War, which actually starts in 1959 and then goes on for many, many years till it ends in 1975. So the 1950s marks the period of tremendous churn as far as American history is concerned. But if we go back to our understanding of the socio-political background, we shall see that, for example, Rangarao in contemporary American literature says that in the 1960s and 70s, America was stirred socially and intellectually in the same manner in which England was stirred in the latter half of the 19th century. The consequent 2 world wars caused huge economic degradations and unemployment, along with the depression. This is something that you are already familiar with because, as you already know, depression is something that happened in America in the 1930s. All through the 30s, America endured tremendous economic depression. And of course, there was a lot of social upheaval which was noticed because there were many people who believed that they were not actually included into the mainstream of American society. We therefore witness a lot of assassinations. So a lot of political leaders are killed. And perhaps the most famous assassination of them all has to be the assassination of the President John F. Kennedy. He was assassinated in November of 1963, 22nd November 1963 to be exact. And soon after that, in 1965, there was the assassination of Malcolm X, there was the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1967, and that of Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, in 1965. Why do I mention the assassination of Malcolm X, and why do I mention the assassination of Martin Luther King? These two assassinations, I think one has to be aware, are extremely important because Malcolm X was a very charismatic member of the African American community, and he was almost single-handedly responsible. Of course, there were others, but he was almost regarded as the leader of this group called the Black Panthers. Now, the job of the Black Panthers was basically to impress upon the American mainstream that they have to give honor, respect, and dignity to the black people. So social activists, artists, writers, they all expressed their vehement and sometimes rather violent opposition against those people who were actually advocating war. So this is also the time when we have tremendous anti-war protests. So we have the anti-war protests, we have the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965, another very charismatic speaker, Martin Luther King, is assassinated in 1967. You, in your American literature course, are going to read Martin Luther's most famous speech, I Have a Dream. We move on, therefore, to exactly what are the things that characterize this particular period of 1950s to 2000. Well, the 1950s is regarded as a period of cultural traditionalism and complacency. Literature of this period is marked by the emergence of strong anti-establishment and anti-traditional literary movements as well. Now, before we talk about cultural traditionalism and complacency, we have to understand what this means. What it means is that in the 1950s, America sort of went back, as it were, to a time when women did not have much freedom and when men had a lot of freedom. So 1950s was a rather troubling decade because in this decade, women were being told to get back into the kitchen and men were being told that they have to take on more responsibility in the public life. So there was a very clear gender divide that was happening in the 1950s, and all of these gender divisions were actually being carried out in the name of tradition. So people were being told women should get back to cooking, women should get back to doing housework, and men should actually do housework. But if we go back, this was the time when there was a certain cultural traditionalism. And as I was telling you, that basically meant that women were being asked to give up their jobs, women were being asked to go back into the house, and men were being told that you have to be men. So there was almost a reinforcement of patriarchy during this time. But there were also other people who were protesting against it. And the one group of writers that I think absolutely should be mentioned in this context are the beat writers. So there were people like Allen Ginsberg, there were people like Jack Kerouac, and what they were doing was they were rejecting traditional styles of poetry. They were reinventing American poetry. But of course, it was not a complete reinvention, because if you look at Allen Ginsberg's poetry, you will find that the kind of poetry that he's writing is heavily influenced not only by the British Romantic poet, that is to say William Blake. Well, William Blake is regarded as the first Romantic by many historians of literature, but Allen Ginsberg's poetry also, more importantly, carries in itself distinct echoes of the poetry of Walt Whitman. So it is almost as though Allen Ginsberg is trying to write the kind of poetry in the 1960s that Walt Whitman was writing in the 1800s. So the appearance and disappearance of different schools and movements was another characteristic of American literature. There were two things that were happening. As I have told you, there were some people who were writing in a very traditional way, and then there were others who were also writing in a rather non-traditional way. So they were doing a lot of experimentation. There were writers who rejected many traditional art forms and styles and created and adapted new artistic ways of expression. For example, there were poets who basically were writing vers libre, which is a French term which translated into English means free verse. Now, I would once again ask you to remember that Walt Whitman was already writing free verse in the 19th century. So when they are writing in free verse, it is not as though they're actually inventing free verse, but they're certainly reinventing free verse in the sense that they are writing a kind of poetry which is free verse, but they are suiting that poetry to the time. That is something that I think you should be aware of. Well, in the field of poetry, new forms of poetry like confessional poetry, nuclear protest poetry were becoming very popular. And in the field of theatre, there were various new forms of plays, for example, absurdist plays that were also coming into existence. And in the context of absurdist play, of course, the most famous American playwright that I could think of is, of course, Edward Albee. There were, of course, many writers who were producing what we can vaguely call realist fiction. But remember that when these people were writing realist fiction, they were writing about their own time. And they were also pushing the boundary of censorship. That is to say, they were trying to see how far they can express themselves in their literature. What are the things that they can talk about in their fiction? What are the things that they can't talk about in their fiction? And over here, I would certainly want to mention Henry Miller. Henry Miller was rather important because when he was writing his novels, they were openly erotic. They were very sexual. So when Henry Miller is writing these incredibly sexual novels, he is experimenting. He's trying to understand how much can the American public take. At what point will the American public refuse to take? So he was clearly pushing the boundary of what I can write in literature and what I can't write in literature. Norman Mailer's novels were very overtly political. He was certainly writing about America in its own time. He was writing about war. He was writing about the way in which America as a country, as a culture, as a politics, as a civilization was darkening. There was, of course, somebody like William Burroughs. William Burroughs is somebody that you would also want to associate with the Beat movement. I've already talked about Allen Ginsberg. I've already talked about Jack Kerouac. William Burroughs also belongs to that group. He was again writing remarkably not traditional, but remarkably bold novels. And as perhaps two of his best known novels are Queer and The Naked Lunch. So these were the kind of fiction that was being written. And of course, very importantly in this time, you have somebody like Vladimir Nabokov. Now, Vladimir Nabokov, as you can very well tell, is not a traditional American name. And you'd be right, he is originally Russian. But he settled in America. And perhaps now, when you think about Vladimir Nabokov, the one book that everybody has either heard of or has read is, of course, his novel Lolita. Now, what he was doing in Lolita is that he was also experimenting with what he can talk about in his fiction. Because in Lolita, this is the story of an elderly man who is seduced by a very young girl. So there are all of these novels that were being written, and of course I have mentioned absurdist drama. I've also talked about Edward Albee. Now, moving on, we come to the way in which confessional poetry becomes a very important part of this period. The emergence of confessional poetry is a type of poetry of the personal or the I. So therefore, this form of poetry starts in the late 1950s and early 60s. Major poets are Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, who is there in your syllabus. So you are going to read some of Sylvia Plath's poems, Anne Sexton, W.D. Snodgrass. Lowell's book, Life Studies, John Berryman's The Dream Songs are the best examples. It is believed that such poetry influenced the Indian poet Kamala Das, who practiced this genre in her poetry. But there were other kinds of poems that were very political, and they were very public. And of course, one of the most public kinds of poetry that we come across at this time is, of course, nuclear protest poetry. Now, one of the most striking features or contributions of this period is the emergence of nuclear protest poetry. What were they doing? This genre of poetry, people who are writing this kind of poetry, they were protesting against nuclear weapons, which, as you know very well, have the capacity to destroy the entire human civilization in the twinkle of an eye. Allen Ginsberg, for example, has expressed his anger against America and nuclear weapons in his poem The Plutonium Ode in the following way: America, America, when will we end the human war? Go fuck yourself with your atom bomb. So therefore, this, as you can imagine, it is the language of great anger. This is the language of tremendous, tremendous anger. And Allen Ginsberg is protesting against the way in which America is spending so much money developing weapons that are so incredibly destructive. This is also the time when you finally see the emergence of new identities and new literatures within the mainstream American literature. And writers from different ethnic groups, for example, and ethnic communities within the country, they are starting to use their arts and literatures to articulate their voices. And perhaps something that absolutely needs to be talked about in some detail over here, I think, is the further development of Afro-American literature and criticism. Remember that if we go all the way back to the 17th century or even 18th century, we already saw the slave narratives. So you could very well say that in a certain sense, perhaps African American literature can be traced all the way back to the slave narratives. But of course, as you know, that slavery ends in America, but the ending of slavery does not necessarily mean that the African Americans in America are no longer oppressed. In fact, something quite horrifying happens. The oppression on them actually increases. Now, let us look at the way in which this developed. So, for example, you have a lot of people from Africa, and they are cheap, and they are easily employable, and they are actually sold into America. Now, look at the way in which this advertisement that appeared in the Boston Evening Post on August 3rd, 1761, look at the language of it, because the language says, to be sold, a parcel of likely Negroes important for Africa. Look at the way in which people or groups of people are being referred to as a parcel. They are actually being referred to as a package. So it is almost as though these people who are being forcibly brought into America, they are not even human. They are being treated as objects. Their groups are being called parcels. So the above advertisement revealed two very basic facts. First, it showed how painful it was to be an imported black slave. And second, it also showed the cruelty of the white American. Also at this time, we have an absolute explosion of feminist movement and feminist literature. This becomes stronger and stronger, and after 1950, women start to demand equal opportunities, equal pay. In 1966, we have now the National Organization for Women, which is formed for the fight of gender discrimination through the courts and legislatures. Women come out openly against the Vietnam War. And in August 1970, the feminist movement goes for a huge strike for equality. We also have to keep in mind that in 1973, we've got the National Black Feminist Organization. Now, the reason why I would want you to concentrate a little bit on the Black Feminist Organization is because a lot of black women felt that the mainstream feminist movement was predominantly white, and therefore their own concerns as black women were not being addressed. So therefore the black women felt that they were being doubly marginalized. They were being marginalized because of their race, but they were also being marginalized because of their gender. Some feminists felt the need of unity and the absolute desire that they felt and the need that they felt to build the spirit of a common sisterhood that goes beyond race. And you have a lot of feminist literature that is being produced. I would only want to talk about a lot of theory here, but of course there is a lot of fiction too. Let us really talk about, for example, Betty Friedan. Now, Betty Friedan, who was a liberal feminist, she believed in a kind of feminism which is popularly now called bra burning, anti-man, or the orgasm school of feminism. So Betty Friedan was very much talking not only about the liberation of gender, but also the liberation of sexuality. However, the present feminist movement in America, there is also a very, very strong notion that women's sexual rights should be honored. For example, in this year, they virtually burnt their bras and organized a topless parade in public as a symbolic protest for equality between men and women. Also, as I have told you, along with other kinds of literature, that is to say African-American literature, feminist literature, literature from other ethnicities, we certainly see the emergence of Native American voices. Please understand that for many, many centuries almost, the Native Americans were methodically decimated, they were oppressed. They were put into what are called reservations. These are tiny areas in which they have to live. So therefore, for a very long time, although these were the people that were the original inhabitants of the American continent, they were pushed into the sidelines. It is in the 1950s and 60s that they start to not only produce their own art, but also to produce their own literature. And there are a few that I think if we move a little forward, then we can certainly talk about a few persons that I think you need to keep your eye peeled for. So let us talk about somebody like Vine Deloria Jr., one of the most outspoken voices among the Native American writers. One should try to look at Custard Diet for Your Sins, an Indian manifesto, which inspired the Native Americanism in the 1960s and 70s. Major writers such as Sherman Alexie, Charles Eastman, Deep Woods, and of course Charles Eastman Deep, who also wrote Woods to Civilization, and The Indian Today, The Past and Future of the First American. So these are some of the books that I think you would certainly want to take a note of. And something else that begins to happen is Indian Americans begin to write. Of course, this is a very, very new development. Indian Americans begin to write sort of towards the 1970s and 80s. I think the first person that I can think of is Bharti Mukherjee, who lived in Canada. She was originally from Calcutta, then she lived in Canada for some time before moving to the United States. Bharti Mukherjee is of great historical significance because she is the first person to be an Indian American who was writing fiction. Later on, of course, there are many, many people who come in. Jhumpa Lahiri, of course, is the best known example of that. But there are others. There are Zulfikar Ghosh, who wrote The Loss of India in 1964. There is Meena Alexander with her poetry. Most importantly, The Bird's Bright Ring. Vikram Seth's rather extraordinary the work, Golden Gate. Something that you should know about the Golden Gate is that although Golden Gate is a novel, but this is where it becomes rather interesting. It is a novel in the sonnet form. So the entire novel actually is a big poem. Now, when he was writing this poem, he was clearly inspired by not an Indian, but he was inspired not by an American, but by a Russian. So he was very, very heavily influenced by the poet Pushkin. So there is a very clear influence of Pushkin on the work of Vikram Seth. We certainly have Amitav Ghosh, who is writing in an antique land. We have Geeta Mehta, who is writing a River Sutra. Jhumpa Lahiri, of course, I've already talked about. And of course, we've got Amitabh Kumar with his passport photos. Jewish American literature also occupies a rather important aspect of American literature. Philip Roth, I think, is somebody that absolutely should be given a lot of importance to. We have to look at Philip Roth's novels such as Portnoy's Complaint. We have to look at Goodbye Columbus. And we also look at his novel, The American Pastoral. William Gaddis is another one for his novel, The Recognitions, and J.R., written in 1975. So there are a lot of people who are writing Jewish American literature. And of course, there is Saul Bellow. Saul Bellow is also a part of your course. Chinese American literature, something that is sometimes called Asian American literature. But when they're saying Asian American literature, they basically mean literature from what we would call the Far East. Maxine Hong Kingston, Amy Tan, are very, very important figures in this particular connection. We have the Chinamen, Amy Tan's novel from 1980. We've got Trip Master Monkey, his fake book. We also have other women who are writing, Chinese-American, Jude Snow Wong, Diana Chang, C.Y. Lee, Joy Kogawa, Fuzhou Lawson Inada, Sky Lee, and Luong Ung. So there are all of these writers who are producing rather wonderful fiction as Chinese Americans. This is where I think it would be important to mention that towards the 1950s, we also, well actually from the late 1940s onwards, we see a distinct growth in the development of lesbian and gay literature. In this case, I will have to probably mention a novel by Gore Vidal, The City and the Pillar, which was produced in 1948. But we certainly see a great flowering of lesbian and gay literature around this time. There is a gay novel in your syllabus, Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, which we are going to do later. So this is rather interesting because according to Charles E. Bressler, who wrote in his book Literary Criticism, the beginning of this reclamation and ongoing development of peculiarly African-American literary theories and criticism has helped other marginalized groups such as gays and lesbians to develop their own critical theories and practical criticism. It is very important for me to note that not only does the gay and lesbian movement learn a lot from African-American theorization, criticism, literature, but they also learn a great amount from the feminist movement. And I would certainly want to mention Arab American literature, and among the most famous writers would be Diana Abu Jaber, whose novel Arabian Jazz and her memoir, The Language of Baklava, is something that we should keep an eye out for. But there are other writers as well, such as Ethel Adnan, Rabi Alameddin, and the poet Naomi Shihab Nye. What is happening as far as theatre is concerned? What kind of plays are being written? This is where we have to remember that there is certainly a lot of popularity for folk theatre. Folk drama is another key feature of contemporary drama. For example, Abraham's Bosom is such a play. Paul Green got the Pulitzer Prize for this play. The black drama, or rather African-American theatre, becomes very, very important. And in this context, you would be very happy to know that one of the most important examples of African-American theatre, Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, is there in your syllabus. So there is a flowering. Of course, I would also have to mention Amiri Baraka, who is also contributing to this. What else is happening? You have to understand that there are a lot of people who are writing theatre who come from various political affiliations, from various political beliefs. So you've got the agenda theatre, which comes, in the wake of the civil rights legislation in the beginning of the mid-60s. You also have people like Sam Shepard. We've got Neil Simon. You also have very important women dramatists like Beth Henley. You've got Marsha Norman, Megan Terry, Paula Vogel, and of course the gay rights movement and the AIDS crisis of the 1980s produces other playwrights such as Christopher Durang, Holly Hushes, Karen Malpidi, and Larry Kramer. And this is where I think I would absolutely have to mention the name of Tony Kushner, whose play Angels in America is regarded as a classic. So you should certainly take a look at Tony Kushner's play Angels in America. In order to conclude, I would therefore say that diversity is one of the most important features of the literature of the 1950s all the way through to the present day. Every single aspect of this very wide range of literatures is impossible for me to discuss, but please be aware of the fact that literature does not only remain an artistic enterprise. Literature is now openly and overtly claimed as a kind of politics. So therefore, identity politics becomes a very important part of later American writing. Thank you.